Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We're in it now. We are in it. We are in the slipstream. We are one day less than 2 weeks before the general election, November 5th, as you know. Uh, and you know, I'm going to dedicate my intro today to a lot of questions I've gotten about early voting. Not like, we were just talking before we started recording about, what if your envelope arrives and it's already sealed and all this kind of stuff with your mail voting and stuff like that. But we've had early voting has, it starts in different states at different times, but it's been going on now for, 4 or 5 days max, something like that. It's just kicking off in other states. And so we're seeing a lot of numbers reported, right? And there's a lot of speculation about what those numbers mean. I have been watching those. I've been watching those numbers and that speculation closely because I cover these things and I want to keep my eyes out what's going on. But I'm also just a person, right? I'm looking for whatever hints that I can find. The big story is if someone is telling you it's looking good in the early vote or it's looking bad in the early vote, they probably have no idea what they're talking about. That is the message. It is very hard to draw any conclusions from the early vote, mainly for one reason or two reasons, but let's talk about the first reason. There's an osmotic relationship between the early vote and the election day vote. If you're seeing more early votes than usual or fewer early votes than usual, the most logical explanation for that is that the ones that are missing are going to show up on election day or vice versa. Not always, but that's the most probable scenario. And your ability to distinguish between that scenario and one that makes a difference, you have almost no ability to do that. When I say you, I mean you and me. People in the campaigns with a little more data, they may be able to kind of, put something together, but you or I can't. And the people in the campaigns, they're not going to tell us the truth. So if you're hearing stuff about the early vote, in almost every case, I want you just to sort of dismiss it. The other reason that it is very, very hard to get any information from the early vote is that there is really no baseline. If we had not had a historic pandemic 4 years ago, that might be different, but it's not. Remember, Democrats were all voting early and by mail last cycle. And not only were Republicans not tending to do that, but their presidential candidate, Donald Trump, was basically telling him that the only legitimate vote was an election day vote. So it was heavily, heavily polarized. This time, Democrats aren't worried about COVID. I'm going to hear from some people who say we should still be doing this, still be doing that. You're probably right. But basically, that's not a factor. And the Republican Party, although not always Donald Trump, has been telling their voters, vote early. And they're the operatives who are telling them that are smart to do that. So there is no way that you are not going to have, at least in relative terms, a lot more Republican early voting and a lot less Democratic early voting than in 2020. That is absolutely guaranteed. So what that means is, again, there's no baseline to judge against. How much it'll change, we don't really know, but we know it's going to change. So there's no baseline. And in the nature of early voting and mail voting and all this stuff, You can't go back to 2016 because this is a rapidly evolving part of American election administration. So 2016 and 2012, those are ancient history in terms of early voting and mail voting. And so what that means is, again, there's no baseline to go against. As we get to the end of the early voting period, there might be some hints. Um, and we may get into some, some more examples of this during the episode. But really, whatever people are telling you about the early voting, I can almost guarantee you should dismiss it, or at least dismiss it until early voting is over and we actually know what the size of the early vote will be. And even then, probably dismiss it. The reality is right now, we are like, we're in a plane, we're in a storm, we're not in the cockpit, we don't have the controls in our hands, and we can't see the instrument panel. Right? And especially for like, if you're an aerophobe like me, that is not a comforting thought, but that's the reality. That's the reality of where we are right now. So we may get into that topic a little more during this episode, but I just wanted to kind of put that in front of you because that is, whether it makes you feel better or worse, it puts you in touch with the reality of the situation. So one other thing, it's our co-host's birthday tomorrow. Tomorrow is, I'm looking at my computer calendar here. That's October 24th, so Thursday. As usual, we're recording this on Wednesday. So, if you wanna tell Kate happy birthday, she's Kate at talkingpointsmemo.com. You can send her birthday wishes. You can also send her a present, or send her whatever. Send her good stuff. So Kate, what are you resisting the urge to look at early vote totals?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because all the reasons you said are the biggest factors to why we can't listen. And, with the COVID thing, I think the one caveat you have there is Nevada's been doing basically all mail elections since 2022. So maybe you're like, well, there's a data point we can use. But I think the other piece you added about Republicans deciding that being actively antagonistic against the early vote was hurting their chances is such a big factor there. Like, I'm sure a lot of our listeners follow John Ralston, this Nevada reporter, dean of the Nevada Press Corps, blah blah blah. And he has been keeping an early vote tally. And I think a day or two ago, it was historic Republican turnout. We haven't seen numbers this high before. And then people are freaking out. And then you kind of drill one level deeper. And then it's the next day, it's like, okay, more stuff is coming in from Clark County, right? The lead is being chewed away. And then you also have huge numbers of independents that we have absolutely no idea which way this group is leaning. And I think it all goes into this bigger general point that we have become so accustomed to this horse race framing, which is, Republicans are leading now, Democrats are catching up, and Democrats have taken the lead. And it's not a basketball game. Like, that's a totally made up way to process this information that is largely so cable news can fill 24 hours of election coverage. Like, all these votes are going into a pot, and we are just getting kind of random updates as they are added to the pot.
Or
Of
counted?
course,
Yeah.
right, as it may be. And as we get far enough into it, then you get into territory, right, where networks can like make the call, where they can project based on where in the state the outstanding vote is. That just gives them a really high degree of certainty that, one candidate or the other has passed the point where they could be caught. But right now, in these early days, we've just got no idea. Like, think of it as if you were someone who was traumatized by the New York Times needle, when there would be like 1% of the vote counted, and every time that 10 more ballots would come in, it would like swing wildly to the other side. We just don't know yet. There are so many cross-cutting factors here. And I know everyone is absolutely desperate for information, and maybe even more so than usual because the polls are just so useless right now in telling us anything but this is a close race. But I just think for your mental well-being, you can create for yourself a healthier election ecosystem, which is instead of getting absolutely meaningless updates every hour, like you can just wait till we have more of a bulk of things counted and any actual meaningful indicators about which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. And emphasize your point about John Ralston, who is, as you say, the dean of Nevada reporters, very smart guy. He's one of the few people who I pay any attention to at all on early voting. And as you say, and this is what you described has continued into, I guess at least last night or whenever he's been saying each day Republicans are putting up historic numbers, blah 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 blah. I would rather he be saying something different, but what we're saying here still applies in that case. And if you look at what he's actually writing, he agrees. And having watched his kind of play by play over the last few years, he will always say, great numbers for this party. If this continues, X will happen. Well, if it continues. He has a kind of a Perils of Pauline sort of style of reporting where if it continues, it will be a bloodbath for this side, or it will be euphoria for that side. And the other, I think you mentioned this. I'm not sure. Another wild card fitting into this, which again he references if you look down a couple paragraphs, is that they changed the registration system in Nevada, I 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but they switched to an automatic registration system, and the default is you're registered as an independent. You have to fill out another form to be registered as a Democrat or Republican. So the number of independents has gone up a lot, and Democrats think that a lot of those independents are actually Democratic voters who didn't take the time to to register as Democrats. Now, are they right? Who knows? But again, it's one of these. I was never good at math in any point in my education, and you can probably pick that up if you look closely at anything I write about these things. But it's sort of like a formula where everything's a variable and you have to solve for the formula. Well, you can't because you don't have enough. You have too many variables and not enough integers. So there's no way to do it. So yeah, that is the general proviso for this for where we are right now. You and I are not really able to get to the bottom of this, I think is what it comes down to.
Yeah, and so we're less than 2 weeks out from the election, right? We're in primo October surprise territory, right? This old bugaboo of politics, which has come to mean some big nugget of information that drops right before the election and that hijacks the news cycle in a way that is generally bad for one of the candidates. So the campaign cycle is ending on this super bum note, and that matters because a lot of undecided voters who get to decide the elections don't make up their minds till the 11th hour. So that story traditionally has had great ability to kind of reach and poison the well right before they go to the ballot box. And our kind of our traditional October surprises of the last couple cycles were the Comey letter for in October for Hillary, which kind of ensured that the but her emails nonsense would stay the story du jour up until the election. And then some would argue that the October surprise in 2020 was the quote unquote suppression of the Hunter laptop story, which if you talk to anyone on the right, they will tell you that among many other ways that's kind of how the election was stolen by the complicit media, which we've seen over and over again. It's just like in the pocket of Joe Biden, just ride or die for Joe. So this year, this has been, I think, a valid concern for, especially I've read people on the left who are worried that some unholy combination of the Trump campaign, foreign disinformation, and the kind of mainstream media with its blind spots, or whatever you want to call it. Its affinity for kind of both sidesing things to Trump's advantage would combine to drop some kind of horrible thing in this last run up, whether it's true or not, that permeates the news environment and kind of, and poisons things for Harris. Now, what's interesting is we have had some major stories, even in the last like 24, 48 hours, and they have almost all been awful for Trump. And, when I say stories, also self-created stories, right? Like a lot of these are headlines he has created. But I don't know if we are living in a post-October surprise world where media is so bifurcated that kind of big stories wouldn't have the ability to poison the well in the way that they could even 2 cycles ago. Or, there's a possibility that this is just the kind of Trump standard, right? That he can kind of, we talked about this ad nauseum. He can get away with saying ridiculous stuff and it's already baked in, so it doesn't change things. Even though I would then caveat onto that I would say with these kind of recent kerfuffles, which we'll get into, they have at least created a little bit more of ink spilled than his previous kind of brain oozing out of his ears nonsense. But Josh, what do you think of the whole can an October surprise exist anymore? Are we past it? Like, what do you think?
You know, I don't know. I mean, yesterday I had a moment. These weren't like surprises exactly, but they were kind of three things that came together sort of in my line of sight at one time. And one was, I don't know, I think it was Politico, maybe Axios, had a headline that was basically Trump campaigns, 24-step plan for overturning the results of the election if they lose. I'm like, okay, like, I don't think that surprises anyone. We know that's the plan, but to just see it there, you're like, wow, that should be damaging, right? You'd think. And then you have these four-star generals, retired four-star generals, at least one of whom is a pretty diehard conservative. I don't think we really know Mark Milley's politics, but certainly characterologically, you don't have a lot of activist Democrats who are four-star generals. I'm not saying they're all like Republicans, but it's kind of it's a bit in the nature to be at least culturally conservative. You have both of them saying Trump is a fascist, and like, okay, that's pretty damning. And then you have this one quote from Trump where I guess, what is he promised to pay the funeral expenses of a dead soldier. And then when he finally gets the bill, he's like, doesn't take $60,000 to bury a fucking Mexican or fucking, I don't know what it was, but like just a sneering racist comment about stiffing someone on the bill for a funeral. But I was just thinking kind of like, these should each be sort of like shocking and damaging things, but clearly like they won't be because, partly partly it's the bifurcated media, partly it's just the sort of the Trump distortion vortex. And partly there is clearly a significant number of Trump supporters who know he's an asshole and a bad person, but they just think he's got the knack of beating inflation or whatever. And kind of, I think what it means overall is that it's a different world for Republicans than for Democrats. The mainstream media just sort of says, oh, we know this stuff about Trump, doesn't matter. Kamala Harris certainly would not get that treatment. I think the most generous way you can put it is that it's got to go against type, right? It's got to be something like if you saw something, you're like, wow, Kamala Harris, I don't know, like when she became vice president, she went on payroll for the Xerox Corporation to give them secret information. You'd hear that and you'd be like, wow, That's disappointing. That's kind of shocking. But with Trump, you assume all those things. So you don't know an October surprise till you see it. I guess that's what makes it a surprise. I mean, the other thing though is that it's hard. It's hard to think of something quite like Hillary's emails was in 2016. It wasn't like that came out of the blue. It's a fuse that was, you know, was basically bogus from the very beginning. It was lit more than a year before the election. It was drip, drip, drip. Comey comes out and like not exonerates her, but kind of says no investigation, but also then like shits all over her for like 20 minutes. And then it's done, but it's still, but then it kind of resurfaces in the Russian hacked emails. And then we have this thing where kind of like, surprise, it's back. So there was like so much, it coming back. It had so many roots in the past. It's truly hard to imagine anything on either side that's going to be like that.
I mean, you could almost make the same argument for the non-October surprise of the Hunter laptop stuff too, right? Like Republicans had been slinging all the mud they could find. They made it very clear that it was too hard to kind of make Joe Biden scary. So the easiest in was Hunter. And obviously that didn't come to fruition, but similarly, it didn't arrive out of the clear blue, right? Like we knew they were trying to do that. So if you
I mean,
just,
he'd been impeached.
right.
Basically over it already.
So if you do
Yeah.
the thought experiment of what is the case that they've been trying to make against Harris, which would naturally lead to whatever October surprise, real or fabricated, they could make, it's more difficult because I mean she's been a candidate for such a short time, and they spent so long after her announcement throwing spaghetti at the wall to kind of see what would stick, that I think even now there isn't really one through line of attack against her,
I
right? You
think that's
kind of
really right.
have,
I think that's really right.
you've got the like, she's dumb, she's, on drugs occasionally, Trump will like throw into the mix. You have that. You have like the comrade Kamala, she's a scary leftist thing. You have the like, she performed trans surgeries in prison stuff. It's like kind of a word cloud of various topics that appear on the Fox News A block, and then whatever attempt they can try to make to connect it back to her.
I think that's exactly right. They're generic accusations, too liberal, too left. Um, your kid is going to come, she's going to convince your kid to get a transition to another gender. But these aren't storylines, and the right's sort of forte is storylines. And even with Biden, who we know historically just was largely immune to these storylines, there were two storylines they had put huge amounts of time in. One was his age and his, dementia and all this kind of stuff. And then the other was the Biden crime family and Hunter and the relatives and, the payoffs to Zelensky or vice versa. So those were kind of narratives that could be picked up on. And that clearly, I mean, we're not going to get into Hunter Biden's laptop, but one of the reasons that all real reporters were so hesitant, rightly, not just at the time, but in retrospect, was that it was just like, you're not even getting creative. This is just like trying to do WikiLeaks part two. But as you say, for this one, there really is no storyline. It just doesn't exist. And it is funny that early voting, which we talked about in another context, does play in here, in the sense that by I don't know what the exact statistics are this year. It's going to be less than 2020 because of the reasons we just talked about. But 3 days before the election, it's a lot of the elections already happened. So that actually does change things, and that is why I think that is why this period is so difficult in such a close election for for political junkies, because in many ways, starting a week or two ago, story moved from things we can see in public to things that we can't see, which is basically, you know, get out the vote operations across, across all those states. Um, Decision making that is very opaque in the relatively few swing voters, kind of undulations of enthusiasm on different sides and all that kind of stuff. So, and we just can't see that. You're not going to, the polls are, the polls have definitely tightened over the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's no question about that. However, a normal polling error, which I'm not even sure you can call an error, is about 3 points. And so if you're talking about that expanse, these movements kind of are irrelevant. So the polls aren't going to tell you much. Um, who's commanding media attention isn't going to tell you much anymore. It's all kind of out of our view, which makes it which drives people crazy. It, makes them start looking at early vote totals.
And in terms of some of these late breaking stories, the general's fascist bucket, right, has been probably the big headline. And what seems to have happened there is, you had Milley and Mattis talking to various print reporters and saying, yeah, he, kind of fits the definition of a fascist. And that seemed to bring John Kelly off the sidelines. And then he gave a quote as well where, he said similar things. And then we got anecdotes mixed in about, sleeping in gym clothes so they'd be ready to kind of rush to the White House in case Trump tried to drop a nuke and that kind of thing. And what I have to say here, Millie Mattis, John Kelly, I know you guys are listening. I know you're big fans of the show. Go on TV. My God, they are tiptoeing this information out with utmost delicacy in a way that only the hardcore people will see it. We live in a new era. This needs to be a TV clip. If you're willing to call him a fascist in print, why aren't you willing to just freaking go on CNN and say it there? I mean, it's this classic just half-assery by these kind of, career Republicans who don't like Trump. It's the same. I know we already said this. I'm not going to get into it again, but it's the same thing as being well, I'm going to write in Ronald Reagan. And it's well, very courageous of you. Thanks for standing up for the Republic, go on TV. You're seeking out reporters to tell them this stuff. Just say it in front of a camera.
Yeah. I mean, they're almost certainly not going to. And at a certain level, what we're really saying is the people who need to hear this are trying really hard not to hear it. So you're going to need to bust into their house, go full SWAT team on them and rush up into their face. And instead of bludgeoning them like a home invasion, you're just going to say Trump is really a fascist and you need to do the right thing. Because, look, it should be enough to have these 4-star generals saying this guy is a fascist. We're all in danger if he's president again. And I guess in some ways Kelly was the big get, because he was the only one. Milley was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, so he's just a career. He's a civil servant, analogous to a civil servant. And Mattis was, kind of one of these early guys who, I'm doing this for the country to kind of keep things on the rails. John Kelly was the only one who was yeah, I'm a Trumper. Let's do this. Let's kick some immigrants out of here. He's a really conservative dude. So in a way, him going there was the biggest deal. But it for whatever reason, it does. I shouldn't even, it does the upstanding Americans a disservice to say that it doesn't matter. Trump's supporters are fine with this. They support it. They want it. And it's, it, again, it's a little unfair to say it doesn't matter. There's 47% of the country who they're like, yeah, let's do it. Let's be fascist. I don't know what else to say.
No, I mean, it matters. And this is the counterpoint to my go on TV screed, which still they should do, which is there is polling, some of which is public. Blueprint has done a lot of this, where the consistently kind of best testing messages for undecided voters center on Trump's own administration has turned against him in record numbers. That's really compelling to people. Like Mike
Mm-hmm.
Pence not being on the ticket is really compelling to people. And we saw this pop up in Trump's Univision town hall, right? With the clip heard around the world of the one guy being like, your own vice president won't run with you, why should I support you, kind of thing. And even if we didn't have that public polling and that data, we'd know that it polls really well because the Harris campaign has been so
Won't stop
singularly
talking about it.
focused
Yep.
on it in this
Yep.
last
Yep.
run. And that's
Yep.
why, she's doing a ton of she's doing Liz Cheney co-appearances, right? And going hard at the kind of look at all the Republicans who are on my side type thing. And we dipped into this a few weeks ago with how it felt like some of the liberal malaise had to do with the fact that so much of the kind of front facing part of the campaign has been so laser focused on the look at all the Republicans who are in my camp type thing. But it's not just a play for Nikki Haley Republicans, which I mean, it definitely is. And there are a lot of them. Like, look how many people voted for her in the primaries in the states that get to decide the election. Like, that is an important chunk. And if even a portion of them are movable, that can be the whole ball game. But there's the secondary piece where these kind of squishy moderate people like the bipartisanship thing. Like, they
Yep.
when people are from opposite parties are nice to each other. It represents what they kind of think of as the bygone halcyon days of American politics, whether that's real or not. So, it's for those people too who maybe aren't these kind of lifelong Republicans who are repulsed by Trump. It's also to just show people she's not scary, she's moderate. In fact, she's so likable that even Republicans are willing to vote for her, right? It is that whole
Yeah.
package.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no question to me that despite some Democrats being, having their nose knocked out of joint about this, that inside the Harris campaign, what they're looking at is they're saying all of our people are totally gung ho. They're going to vote. They're going to, they are totally motivated, totally energized. We got them. We need a few more people. And those are the people we need. Those are the people who are available. And, we know all about suburbs trending Democratic. Who are those people? They're people who used to, in some cases, were Republicans. In other cases, were the kind of people who voted, vote each way sometime, right? Those are trending to Democrats. Uh, really smart Democrats who kind of know these nitty gritty polling demographics things. They think she is going to win this election because you are going to see the redder parts of the suburbs trending even more to her. Not that those redder parts of the suburbs, she's going to win them, but they're going to go from, 60-40 to, 46-54. They're going to keep trending. And who are those people? They're people who are either Republicans or used to be Republicans. So, I mean, you kind of can't have it both ways. You can't say hey, we're kind of, we're making these great gains in the suburbs and not recognize that those are people who are former former Republicans. And it's funny on the bipartisan thing. I was out recently, and I was talking to this person who I know, sort of, almost, uh, a Manhattan liberal Democrat, dyed in the wool, right? Just the kind of that person. And I'm talking to this person about the campaign, and this person was saying, something they heard Harris say, bipartisanship, and they were like, I like when people try to get along and try to have agreements, and it's a reminder that like off Twitter, even like totally never voted for a Republican, very liberal Democrats, even they like it. So this mindset, and which I agree with at some level, this mindset of kind of like fuck bipartisanship. We're not in that era. We're in kind of like a parliamentary system. Our votes, your votes. We're going to increase our votes. We're going to motivate. You're not most people. That is a certain part of hardcore partisans. And again, I think this way, but that's not how most people think. And so those things matter, and that's why they're doing it. They're doing it because that's where the votes are.
And to some degree, it is kind of reflective of these big environmental shifts we're seeing between the party, especially in terms of the Nikki Haley career Republican voters who despise Trump, which is forever. The old way things broke down was, Republicans had the high propensity voters. That's why they kicked ass every midterm. And then in the general, Democrats would always win the popular vote because these big swaths of low propensity voters would turn out and vote for the presidential and kind of never again. And those things have informed every aspect of how the parties campaign, right? I mean, it's why Democrats are the bedwetter party, because you're trying to scare people who don't make a habit of voting into voting, right? To feel like their vote is really important. I mean, this stuff is really ingrained. But now we're seeing a shift, right? The kind of civic duty people, the high responsibility people are being sorted into the Democratic Party. And this is a lot to do with kind of the education bifurcation, especially. And so, as part of that realignment, you now have the Harris campaign trying really hard to get the civic responsibility Republicans, which is not by any means, anything close to a majority of the Republican Party, which is, so completely kind of okay with Trump, but it's a lot of votes in these states, these certain states that she needs to win. So that is playing in too, and I think we're seeing some of these kind of new campaign attitudes throughout. And what it kind of reminds me of is, when Fetterman ran and won in Pennsylvania in 22, he did a different thing than what most Pennsylvania statewide Democrats had done, which traditionally had been you run up your margins in Philly and Pittsburgh and the surrounding suburbs as much as you can, and you hope that's enough to kind of overcome the bleeding from the rest of the state. And he did this helped to buy his whole shtick, right? Like it was an easy fit for him. But he went to these really red areas, campaigned there, put in appearances where Pennsylvania Democrats have never done, and tried to stem the bleeding in those red areas to take a little bit of the pressure off of the kind of city turnout, and just make those margins easier for himself to overcome. And Harris right now is kind of doing a statewide version of that, where you've got the base, and not that they're not doing base service stuff, they still are, but they clearly think that like the base is motivated, right? That those first like 2 months of exuberance, that was for the base. That was to get the base on board. And now she's trying to stem the bleeding with Republicans to a degree that the enthusiasm is enough to overcome it, right? And that depends on picking some people off from these large, more largely unwinnable pots, but bringing some of them over to yourself to make your job easier.
There was an article I read by a former boss of mine named Bob Cudner, my first job in journalism, a place called the American Prospect, and Bob and I had kind of a fractious relationship. I think is probably the fairest way to put it. But anyway, over the last few years, he's written a few things, under Biden that I agreed with, and I saw this piece by him yesterday or something, and it was just a kind of a classic Northeast corridor panic screed. Um, and where he's saying kind of like, Harris has run a lackluster campaign. A lot of us were hoping she'd be running away with it by now, but she hasn't sealed the deal or whatever. And what I hate most about this is that don't try to get your punches in advance to show how you had a better idea before the thing's even over. That helps no one. That's just you sort of like laying some bets in advance for a fight you think is going to happen over blame after everything goes poorly. You know, that's just thinking of your it's just I hate it. But the other part about that is that a lot of people really do think Trump should be losing. If you just kind of do the blocking and tackling, Democrat runs a solid campaign, you're going to beat him because look at him, he's ridiculous, and he is ridiculous. But that's not the world we're living in. And honestly, I think she's run almost a flawless campaign, given the circumstances in which she became the candidate, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, incumbent parties are getting destroyed everywhere across Europe, across all of the countries that are anything like the United States. If you're an incumbent party right now, you get crushed. And the reason that Harris is in this, and I think the ever so slightest of favorites, is precisely because there's a lot of people who look at Donald Trump and just say, I'm not crazy about how things are right now, but he's unacceptable. So we should really try not to demoralize ourselves by thinking, oh, it doesn't matter. It does, nothing he does matters. It actually does matter. And that's the only reason we're actually in this campaign, that she has a chance of winning. So like, when these generals say he's a fascist, which is shocking because the F word is almost like an F word in our politics. It's kind of shocking to me even that they would be saying this, given who they are and stuff like that. It does matter. It does matter. It's that I mean, in some ways, it's what we know, which is that this is who Trump is. And anybody who's paying attention already knows this about him. And again, that's why Harris is in this election.
Yeah, I'm taking this from Amy Walter at the Cook Political Report. But say, you just came out of a coma and you haven't been paying any attention to politics for this cycle. And I told you, you've got an incumbent president with an approval rating at 40 at best, right? Sometimes in the 30s. We are just coming off an unusually high inflationary period. You've got overwhelmingly doomy sentiment about the economy under that incumbent president. Does that incumbent party have a shot in hell of winning the election? You'd say no, right? Of
Yeah.
course not. And yet here we are, where all the conditions favor Trump. The Electoral College favors Trump. We don't know by what degree yet, but it certainly does. I mean, we're living in a world where nobody's wondering if Harris is going to win the popular vote, right? But that doesn't matter. And still, I mean, either a tie or you'd give her the slightest of edges. And you're totally right. And it's important to point that out because, God, if she loses, the vicious criticism is going to rain down from all sides. And I really am honestly very worried that the Democratic Party will never run a woman candidate again. But yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And those people who are doing the equivalent of, tweeting a month or two ago, this was the moment that Harris lost the election, just so they can like retweet it on November 6th if it comes true. Do yourself a favor. Don't listen to them.
Yeah, it's just, and again, there's this is, in a way, this is another permutation that I think a lot of us know. There's a certain kind of hyper political person who basically does the social network equivalent of sitting at the at the lunchroom table, the dining hall table, and saying like, yeah, why should I be excited about Kamala Harris? What is how has she done anything to inspire me? And you're kind of like, dude, is this about you? Is this about you need to like be like, uh, kind of fluffed up to like to be excited enough that you'll vote? Like that is just a toxic and unethical way of thinking about politics, frankly. And this, in a different way, is the same thing. Like right now, we're trying to win this election. And maybe it won't go the way we want, in which case everybody's going to, there's going to be a lot of second guessing and what went wrong and all that kind of stuff. But if you're spending your time now kind of getting your ducks in a row to be best positioned for that argument, like I don't want to hear from you, because that, again, that is an unethical way of approaching civic life. Right now we're trying to win. And if your priority is kind of like, you know, having the best argument afterwards, you're not good.
Also, sorry, it's a 50-50 race. You've got a 1 in 2 shot of being right with these early predictions, and the factors at play are pretty obvious to everyone paying attention to politics, so it's not like it requires a political mastermind to go either, well, Trump won because incumbents are getting killed, or Harris won because she shored up the base and was able to poach Republicans. And, like there are endless permutations of this that it would be really easy to make. And you have like a fairly good shot of being right, not least because we never actually know what wins or loses elections for people. So it's really all speculative. So, it's not even like this is really big brain territory to kind of guess it right at this point.
Well, and there's very perverse incentives, because I think everybody knows that if you're naysaying, you're going to be lined up like with the big "I told you so." And if you're wrong, there's an easy get out of jail, because you're like, God, no one's happier than I am. No one could be more pleased, and then everybody forgets about it. So yeah, there's a lot of perverse incentives, and this is, there's a lot of uh, there's a lot of there's a lot of ethical questions and ethical decisions that we make in civic life, right? About how much we're sort of kind of prioritizing ourselves, our own good, our own fuzzy feelings, our own need to be right, all these kind of things, as opposed to, at least I think what many of us think, that we are interested in politics and we involve ourselves in politics because we want to live in a certain kind of society, and not just us. We want we want all of us to live in a certain kind of society. And one of the paradoxes of this is that a lot of hyper political people are people who have enough education, enough affluence, enough, kind of privilege to spend a lot of times freaking out about politics, that a lot of us are relatively insulated from the impact of these things, right? Um, so I don't know. Those are all things to keep in mind as we navigate. Look, as we navigate what's a very stressful time to be in any election, even between relatively normal candidates, is stressful because there's a lot at stake. There's various policies. Obviously, this one is in a different category. One little thing that caught my eye. There's this guy. God, what is his? I'm spacing on his name. This the CNN data guy.
Harry
I always
Enton.
Yeah, Harry Enton. I'm always thinking Nate's because half the data guys are named Nate, and I couldn't remember his thing. Anyway, he's doing these little he's doing his little TV clips on TV, but CNN's doing a good job, and he's doing a good job of kind of pushing those onto social. So I saw one of them, and he had this rundown of some aspect of the recent polls, and kind of pitching this one, and he pitches them in both directions, pitching this one in a kind of good for Trump kind of direction, and then at the end he said, Harris supporters are much more worried about a Trump victory than Trump supporters are worried about a Harris victory. And when I heard that, I'm like, dude, you buried the lead, because this is actually one of the reasons that I think Harris is going to win. That Harris supporters really are worried about a Trump victory. And at least in how that CNN segment came together, it sort of came together in a sort of a He-Man Trump kind of way. Like, oh, they're cowering in fear because of the big, strong Mr. Trump and all this kind of stuff. But fear is a big motivator. And I think as much as Republicans say about how everybody's going to have to become trans under Harris and all this kind of stuff. Honestly, they're not that worried about it. They're not. And again, this isn't me in my bubble saying it. You just have to look at the polls. They're not as worried about it because it's kind of where we are, and things are kind of okay. And she's not promising all these terrifying things. You kind of, for the Trump people, for Republicans, you can't have it both ways.
Yeah. And speaking of what we're all, worried about, we are going to wrap the episode with the Trump antics corner because he's been just more absurd and foolish than even we've become accustomed to lately. The real capstone of this is Trump going to quote unquote work. Well, more specifically, pretending to work at a closed McDonald's serving pre-screened people slash members of the media, which for anyone wondering if he was going to do this in a suit, almost white button down and suit pants, which is very everyman. But after he did this, there was an E. coli outbreak that killed one person traced to McDonald's. And look, we can't conclusively say it was because of Trump, but I don't know that we can conclusively rule it out either. We
It's
just
it's
have to
it's yeah, it's quite a coincidence. It's quite a
follow the
coincidence.
facts wherever they lead. And I
Do
guess
your
that
own
was
research.
exactly. And I guess that was the point of that was to rehash that ancient Harris thing, right? Of like she didn't really work at
The
McDonald's.
stolen McDonald's valor. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So you can tell they're like really kind of homing in on these devastating attacks in these last few weeks. Um, so you had that. You had, obviously, we talked last week about his 39 minutes of swaying on stage. For some reason, like Elon Musk is doing like star jumps every time he's on stage with Trump. I'm not quite sure what that's about. And then he's also doing what seems to be this illegal gambit of creating mini lotteries for people to vote for Trump, where if you sign his petition, I guess you get $100 for signing. And then if you're like the lucky winner, you get a
You get
million
$1 million.
dollars. And you can only sign the petition if you've registered to vote something, something, something.
Yeah, I
Um,
think it's like if you say you've registered, but yes, it's election. It's not like technically paying you to vote, but at least election lawyers that I've talked to say that as the statutes exist, this is illegal. This is paying for votes as it's construed in the law. And again, You go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, Merrick Garland. Anyone up? Anyone awake? Like, perfect thing to maybe go after, right? But then also B, for those of you who are kind of in that very justified state of like panicking over everything right now. I just want to toss in that like this system gaming type stuff like never really works and also tends to generate so much bad press that outweighs whatever benefit there would be to people being interested in this. But, those are just my 2 cents.
Yeah, there's a lot. They're throwing everything against the wall, and that's even more with. I mean, look, we know from experience that there's a lot of absurdity and incompetence in Trump world, but they also turn out to be pretty canny in some ways. But I think we've seen with Elon Musk that is, this is the rich kid in high school who's uh, throwing around money to get everybody to be his friend kind of thing, and like putting on a big party that no one comes to. This is someone who didn't really know politics existed until about 18 months ago, but he's worth like what, $200 billion or something like this. So there's a lot of like indiscriminately throwing money at everything, and I do get the sense that that part of things is kind of a mess. His part of things is kind of a mess. Maybe Trump will win. Maybe they're going to turn out a kind of, a surge of incel voting or something like that, kind of young, nihilistic men or whatever. But it won't be because of Musk. His part in this drama seems to have been a bit of a bust, which is something, right? We can take some satisfaction in that, since he's such a terrible person.
I also forgot to mention that Trump is spending these precious last minutes on the campaign trail, fantasizing, reminiscing, waxing lyrical about the size of Arnold Palmer's penis, which I think we probably all kind of expected to be in the mix at this point. And that created its own little mini scandal because, the New York Times has some, like, I don't know if it's a mega live blog of everything or just of the day's rallies, but they have one of those going, and their reporter took this digression about his genitals and made it into golf stories. He told golf stories about
Reminisce.
Arnold
Yeah.
Palmer, which of all the kind of whatever you want to call it, sane washing, both sidesing, like, has got to be kind of award worthy. Like, that is incredible. And I had someone send me the response that she got from, writing into, I don't know who they write into now that there's no public editor, but
Right.
whoever, to complain about the article. It was really interesting because the response was very robust. Like, I was expecting some kind of boilerplate type thing of, we do great journalism, we appreciate the feedback, whatever. But it talked about how when reporters are on the trail with him, they sometimes have to file very quickly, and then they kind of will go back and reassess the moment.
Right.
They
Right. Right.
pointed out that in the kind of longer write up that came out of this rally, it was all pegged on Trump's use of quote unquote vulgarities. They even said that they wrote out exactly what he said, which they usually don't do because, and I quote, the paper is read in schools and at breakfast tables, which is almost adorably quaint. And then kind of ended with this huge list of links of, anti-Trump coverage, basically, like
Right.
broken into
Right. Right.
subsections of the, here's his insulting people stuff, here's his he's mentally unwell stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I was surprised by that. It was a pretty kind of detailed point by point, no, we didn't do anything wrong kind of a response.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, good for them. They're at least taking it's a switch for them to be moving off we got bigger fish to fry. You don't understand how it works at our level of elite journalism.
Hear about the Times.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad they are at least doing that. I don't think it and look, I think Kate and I can both agree that you sometimes write things quickly and there are dimensions of it that you didn't focus on. That is real. I don't think what the Times seems to be saying takes into account that in all the quickness, in all of the thinking about the breakfast table, it always seems to kind of go in one direction of late for them, where where there are errors and so forth. But it's at least that's good. It's some sign of progress. That they're responding that way. It's also sort of an example of Trump that it turned out to sort of be a bigger scandal for the Times than it did for Donald Trump. But anyway, so that is the sort of the, I guess, where we'll finish up for this episode. We have what? We have one more. Wait, one more. Do we have one more episode before the
One more.
election? Oh
God,
my
that's
God.
horrifying.
All right. Well, there you are. Remember, Kate's birthday tomorrow. Send her an email wishing her happy birthday. And if we are still
remember to return your ballots and stuff. That's
yes,
that's the
too,
birthday gift I'll ask
too.
for.
But just don't return your ballot to Kate. Yeah, that is the one thing you don't want to do.
Don't get these wires crossed.
Yes, exactly. But I think that's all we have for this episode. Anything else we need to discuss?
That's it.
All right. We'll talk to you next week for the last pre-election episode of this cycle.
See you
later.
then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.